Good evening, folks. Almost ready to start. Just wait a few minutes for the clock to turn over. Let people trickle in. Yeah, we really needed that rain. Been so dry here this summer. We're getting a little bit this fall. Be almost there.
It's 6 o'clock.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhasa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhasa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhasa. So we're moving on today to the second noble truth, the origin of dukkha, which is tanha, usually translated as craving. And again, we have to clarify the translation a bit because this raises another issue that, or I should say, maybe a criticism that sometimes raised against Buddhism from the outside. The charge that the Buddhist philosophy says one has to abandon craving. If you don't have any craving, you just be like a vegetable. You just sit there all day, not doing anything. You've got no motivation um, to to uh, to pursue anything. even meditation, why would you meditate if you have no desire for awakening? And this comes from a misunderstanding of what is meant by tanha. Tanha is more specific. It is a kind of craving, but it's a more specific word than the English word craving or desire. There's another word in Pali, chanda, that is more general, that is the impulse uh, towards anything. So chanda is considered ethically neutral depending on the object. It can be either wholesome or unwholesome. So there is chanda for sensual pleasure, which is the same as one category of tanha. But there's also what's called dhamma chanda, which is the desire or the impulse for the dhamma, with the motivating factor that causes beings to seek liberation. And you could call this a kind of desire, but it's a wholesome desire, dhamma chanda. The tanha is more specific. Tanha is literally thirst, and it is classified as of three kinds. There's three sorts of tanha. There's kama tanha, which is desire for sense objects. Bhava tanha, which is the desire for existence or the desire to be or to become. And vibhava tanha, which is the desire for non-existence or an impulse to annihilation or self-destruction. These are the three specific impulses that are covered in the Second Noble Truth. Kama tanha, or the craving for sense objects, is the predominant one for beings of our level, that is, humans. The entire range of beings, from hell beings, ghosts, animals, humans, and devas, are all incorporated within a category called the Kama Bhumi, or the plane of sensuality. Beings existing at this level have a default consciousness that is dominated by the physical senses. Our sources of information, our desires, our fears, our thoughts, all revolve around sense objects. So this is a very noisy defilement. It's very prevalent. It's kind of a default mode for beings of our sort, of humans and other beings in the Kama Bhumi. And while it primarily refers to the five physical senses, we could also include the mind sense here, a desire for pleasant mind objects. But mostly is referring to pleasant sounds, visions, smells, tastes, touches. You know, the five physical senses. A craving for them is set up, and this is paralleled by a negative form of craving, which is to recoil from, to dislike or avoid unpleasant sights, sounds, smells, tastes, and touches. It's really just a flip side of the same thing. We want to please the senses. The Buddha once gave a very strong image for the nature of sensual desire. He said it's like a leper sitting in the marketplace. He was talking to a group of monks. It's probably referring to an actual person that they had seen, this leper sitting in the marketplace. And his body he's begging for money. His body is covered with weeping sores. And he has beside him on the ground, he has a little brazier of red hot coals. And every now and again, he picks up one of these red hot coals with a pair of tongs and he presses it into one of his sores, and it cauterizes the flesh and gives him momentary relief from the agony of that open sore. The Buddha said if that leper was miraculously healed and could get up and walk away clean and whole, do you think he would ever feel nostalgic and miss his hot coals? And then he explained the metaphor as saying that the weeping sores are like the sense organs, like the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and body. And the hot coals are like desirable sense objects. And they momentarily appease the constant hunger of the sense organs. But if a being were able to transcend that level of consciousness and was no longer dependent on sense objects, he would regard them the same way as the leopard, the healed leper would regard the hot coals. He wouldn't feel any any nostalgia for them. He wouldn't miss them. So it's a very strong image. The idea of the sense organs as weeping sores, and the objects as hot coals that we push into the weeping sore to get momentary relief. Because there is this hunger in this that's tied to the senses, that all the senses are hungry for pleasant objects. And as I said, this type of tanha is at this level, it's the noisiest. It demands the most attention. It's it's very demanding and constantly nagging us to provide pleasant sense objects. But although it is that noisy uh, defilement, it's not the deepest. It's not the doesn't. It's not the most deep seated or the most profound of the forms of tanha. It's comparatively superficial because it is possible for the mind to transcend the sensual level of consciousness, and this is what occurs in jhana, or in rebirth in the Brahma realm, as a being beyond sensuality. But the Brahma gods are not beyond defilement. They're not beyond tanha because of the other two forms, bhava tanha, vibhava tanha. These are more deep seated. They're in the big picture or the longer term, they're actually more of a problem. Bhava tanha is desire to be or to become. At its most simple level, it's just a desire to exist. But it manifests as a desire to be something more than you are, to increase your being in some way, to be more powerful, to be more famous, more rich, to have more authority. These are all forms of bhava tanha. So in one aspect of it is a desire or lust for power. And the Brahma gods are certainly subject to this. The other form of tanha, the last or the third form, is vibhava tanha, the desire to not exist, the desire for annihilation or extinction. So this is the opposite of bhava tanha, and the mind can go back and forth between the two. At its most extreme form, vibhava tanha is a desire for self-destruction, annihilation, a suicidal impulse. But at a more common form, or a lower level of it, is something that uh, every being who's not an arahant will experience from time to time, is just the desire to be less than you are, to lower the level of conscious being. Because consciousness can at times seem like a burden. Excuse me. So beings in the human form have many ways of lowering their level of consciousness deliberately. Drink and drugs is obvious, but something like losing yourself in mindless television shows or oversleeping is a common one. No, these are ways of is dulling down the consciousness, seeking a lesser state of being. So the desire to be or not to be. There are some interesting parallels to this triplet in other traditions. It's striking that in Christianity, when Jesus went into the desert for his 40 days of fasting and meditation at the beginning of his career as the Messiah, he was accosted by the devil, by Satan, who tempted him 3 times. And the 3 temptations correlate quite closely to the 3 forms of tanha. First, Satan turned stones of the desert into loaves of bread to tempt Jesus to break his fast and take food. So this is sensuality, to appease the sense of taste. Then he told Jesus that if you bow down to me and worship me, I will make you Lord and Master of the world, which is under my domain. You will be the great king. And so this is Bhavatana. The final temptation, he said, well, you don't want the bread, you don't want kingship. What's the use of hanging around? Why don't you just throw yourself off the cliff and destroy yourself? So it's Vibhavatana. In the context of the dependent origination, Tanha also occurs as one of the Nidana, that is one of the links in the dependent origination, and it's a very critical one. It's part of the sequence. From sense contact arises feeling, from feeling arises craving, from craving arises clinging. So this link between feeling and craving is often said to be the critical link in terms of practice, because all the steps leading up to feeling are classed as resultant. That means they're a result of past karma, and at the moment of their occurrence, there's nothing you can do about it. It's given. It's like the hand of cards you're dealt from the past. And this goes all the way down to feeling. So feeling, the sense contact, is a resultant, meaning it's ethically neutral. It's neither good nor bad. Likewise, feeling. So we see a pleasant object with the eye, or we taste a delicious taste with the tongue. That itself is not a problem. Then the feeling of happiness arises with that contact. That's also not a problem. That's just a natural reaction and it's not under our control. But then we turn a corner in the dependent origination and we enter the sequence of volitional factors, meaning that we have a, a participation in them. We are um, they are to if we make the effort, they are under our control. So when a pleasant feeling arises, then craving follows. The desire for that desire arises from that pleasant feeling. One wants to experience it again or more or better. The mind goes into craving or tanha. And this is the beginning of the whole downslope. And at that point, at that critical juncture between feeling and craving, the impulse is yet weak and the link can be broken with mindfulness. But once it's past craving and goes into clinging and becoming, it becomes increasingly entrenched. It's like a snowball rolling downhill and gaining mass as it goes. So, this is why, for example, mindfulness directed towards the feelings, Vedanusati, is a very useful practice, a very important practice, to be aware of our feelings. And that includes the neutral feeling. If the pleasant feeling is missed, it tends into craving. Or if it's not, handled mindfully, it tends to slide into craving. The negative or painful feeling tends to slide into aversion, which is really just a negative flip side of craving. But if the neutral feelings are missed, it tends to dullness and boredom. So craving is in this cycle of dependent origination, which the whole cycle of dependent origination can be seen as an extrapolation of first and second noble truth. It's an explanation in detail of how first and second noble truth works. So craving here becomes the beginning impulse for the whole mass of suffering. It starts the whole round going. And without that craving, then the cycle is broken and we don't go on to the other stages. So, in the returning to the formula of the Four Noble Truths, here we have craving identified as the origin of suffering. Tanha is the origin of dukkha. And dukkha, as we saw last time, can be applied to this whole conditional existence. So samsara as a process, as a mass of suffering, of becoming into suffering forms of existence, has its origin with that impulse of craving. At the momentary level, if we bore down into what's happening at the level of mind moments, what's occurring is that the mind wants to take an object. It craves an object. This is tanha at its rudimentary form. It's just consciousness seeking an object, and it seeks it with the impulse to uh, please itself, or even stronger, we could say to complete itself. It's seeking fulfillment in the object. But because the objects are inherently dukkha, they are unable to satisfy the mind. So the mind craving an object takes an object, but it's not satisfied. It may yield a momentary pleasant feeling, but no more than that. And the mind is immediately on to the next one, again seeking fulfillment, seeking its completion in the objects. And it's a losing game. It cannot be won. But this is the primordial addiction. It's something we've been doing for countless lifetimes, moment after moment. In this way, we could see that samsara is something we do. It's something we choose moment by moment. It's misleading to think of it as say someplace we're trapped. It's something we're doing to ourselves deliberately, moment by moment, by craving objects and going after objects. This is the becoming, this is the manifestation, this is dukkha. And it has its root in that craving. And it is possible to transcend that first level of craving in with the mind in jhana, which is available or accessible to beings in the human form. You're experiencing a level of consciousness that is beyond sensuality, but you're still subject to conditionality, you're still subject to samsara, and this is because the two deeper forms of tanha have not been eradicated. So, not only in the case of jhana, but in the mind stream of an anagami, that is the third stage of awakening, sensuality has been utterly transcended, and that first form of tanha no longer exists. But they're not fully liberated because they're still subject to the deeper forms of tanha. And these forms of tanha are also closely related to underlying causes of the two extreme false views. The view of eternalism, which is obviously comes out of desire to be forever, and annihilationism, which comes out of a desire for utter extinction. And both of these miss the middle path. And adherence to such views is just a subtler way of binding oneself to samsara. So we saw last time that in the case of dukkha, the Buddha gave us the charge to understand dukkha. In this case, the Buddha said our task here is to abandon craving. The verb is pahatabati, to abandon or relinquish. So not to let the mind fall into that mood of craving, of desiring. That is the way forward. That's the way to liberation. As long as we're experiencing craving, the mind is not free. The mind is bound. It's caught up in this process of desire. Here's some shiny thing. I want it. I go have to make an effort to get it. Well, if we just abandon that craving, the mind is then liberated. It's free. It's not compelled to chase after this and that. So the second truth lays out the origin of the problem. The first truth we looked at the problem itself, and here's what causes the problem. And then in the third and fourth truth, we get uh, some teaching on the way out of suffering. So I'll stop here at this time and take any questions. I don't see anybody has come up with anything in the chat to ask about yet. Okay, here we go. Bante, can you explain how memory works and how Tanaha affects the memory? Memory is the mind taking a past object, although that's actually not quite accurate because the object is no longer in the past. It's now an imaginary object in the present that reflects or is based on something in the past. And this can, of course, objects from the past can cause a reaction, such as craving or aversion. The mind can desire things that have been lost, and this will of course cause suffering. Or the mind can feel remorse over mistakes made or things that have happened in the past. This is also a negative form of craving. How to deal with tanha of not being able to meet loved ones. Yeah, this is definitely this is one of the forms of suffering that the Buddha enumerated in the first noble truth is not 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 being attached to the desired object or being separated from the loved one. And there's, of course, tanha arises with the desire to be with the loved being. It's just like any other form of tanha. One, if the wise approach would be to just recognize the reality, I cannot be with this person now, and just accept that. And I mean, that's easier said than done. It's not straightforward, but to see that the longing and the craving that arises is just a cause of suffering, and this could be taken as a teaching. You can see the process of first and second noble truth happening immediately, viscerally, right here. Here, I desire this object and I don't have it, so I feel suffering. And that demonstrates in real time the teaching of the Buddha, first, second noble truth. I recall you mentioning that a mind moment is completed of 17 distinct aspects. Is Tanha one of those aspects? Does breaking the cycle occur in a single mind moment? No, Tanha is not classified in that way as one of the 17 Abhidhamma mind moments. Tanha would be the entire set of 17. It would be a process that would compromise tanha. Is the arriving of bodhicitta a form of craving? No, not in the sense of tanha. it would be Kamachanda, or I'm sorry, Dhammachanda, which I spoke about at the beginning. That there is a positive or wholesome, spiritually positive type of craving. This is where the English word is misleading, but it's not called tanha; it's called chanda. It's chanda directed towards the Dhamma. Dhamma chanda is a wholesome impulse. Is wisdom, knowledge of the object of meditation essential to contemplate that object while practicing meditation? To a limited extent, one must have an immediate contact with the object of meditation, like the breath, but then the object would be the sense of touch. But that doesn't mean you need to understand all the biology of respiration before you can do breath meditation. Could be the voidness mentioned in the Maha Sunyata Sutta related with a mind without craving for mind objects. um, yeah, I would I would say that if the mind is resting in emptiness without craving, that's a mind that's at peace. How do we do the Buddha meditation in the Thai forest tradition? We have to say the word aloud at times. I find that it interferes with the observation of my breath. Thank you. What this questioner is asking about is the practice common in the Thai forest tradition of using the two-syllable mantra Buddho with the breath, Bu on the in-breath, Do on the out-breath. And it's usually not recited out loud, it's a mental recitation. And it serves the purpose of anchoring the Vitakka Vichara to the breath. So the mind is not wandering around thinking of this and that. It's anchored to the breath. And some meditators find that very helpful. If you're able to keep the mind still without the recitation of the mantra, that's also a good practice. There's no necessity to use that practice. It's just one possible tool in the toolkit, whatever it takes to get the mind quiet and focused. The higher fetters, ignorance, conceit, restlessness, and subtle desire for form and formless. What is it again? You said that the anagami is completely eradicated with respect to five lower fetters. The anagami has already, the Sotapanna has eliminated the three lower fetters related to view, but the anagami has also eradicated the fetters of sense desire and ill will. So the anagami is beyond sensuality. But as you rightly note, the anagami is still subject to ignorance, conceit, restlessness, and the desire for form and for formless. How beneficial is Abhidhamma? Uh, it can be very useful. It's a it's a study that can elucidate the workings of the mind at a subtle level. It's a very good companion study to the practice of vipassana. Uh, it's not uh, the uh, the main thing about Abhidhamma to if you want to take up the study of it is that the um, the wisdom that's imparted from the Abhidhamma only comes from really delving into the details. And then that can be at the beginning it can seem kind of frustrating because it's such a mass of details to bore into, but then it begins to come together and make sense. What guides us to distinguish chanda from tanha? Um, this was primarily would be the object. because there's no real difference between kama tanha and kama chanda. The- they're both desire for sense objects, and there's no practical difference between them. But tanha is just limited to those three kinds, whereas chanda can also be the desire for liberation, the desire for understanding, the desire for compassion of helping others. That you know, those those are wholesome forms of chanda. Did the Buddha teach Abhidhamma? Well, that's a big question that would take quite a discourse to answer because it's not simple. The Buddha did well traditionally. Okay, I'll start with the traditional view is that the Buddha taught Abhidhamma to the gods and Tawa thinks of heaven, and that what we have is just the bare bones summary that he gave to Sariputta. Um, Historically, this seems kind of doubtful because of the fact that the recensions of Abhidhamma of the different schools, like the Theravada, Sarvastivada, um, Mahasangika, and so on, are quite different from each other. They seem very specific to a school. Um, but the Buddha did, you can find in the suttas principles of Abhidhamma, and particularly in the Samyutta Nikaya, a lot of the um, the discourses are touching on material that is more detailed in the Abhidhamma. After the Bodhisattva made the vow, he was reborn in lower realms. Uh, no, not according to Theravada. After the Bodhisattva took the vow to attain Buddhahood, he was reborn as an animal sometimes, but never in the hell realms. So I guess if you count the animals as a lower realm, yeah, he was reborn into the animal realm on some occasions. Have you ever heard of the dark night of the soul? Yes, that's a phrase from Christian mysticism, and it has its parallel in the stages of insight in Vipassana. Uh, this is there's a series of stages, which I won't get the order of them right off the top of my head, but there's knowledge of fearfulness, knowledge of misery, knowledge of despair. And the mind goes is what is happening is the mind has come into a direct confrontation with the reality of samsara. That the rose-colored glasses have been taken off. You can no longer fool yourself. That and you see the grim side of existence, but you haven't yet seen the way out. So it's a difficult passage, but there is another side to it. You do come out of the other end of it. And what is required if one finds oneself going through that stage, if you reach that stage, is courage and persistence and a warrior spirit to just go through it. Some meditators can get stuck for a long time and have a miserable experience because they're afraid of it, they're uncomfortable, so they back up in the mind. They retreat back into a more comfortable illusion, and then they have to go through it again and again. But if you just bear through it, you can get through it and come to the other side. Do new beings appear in the rebirth cycle, or have we been here for infinity? The traditional view is no, there's no new beings. That there's just beings have always been here. After practicing samatha meditation, I feel free from sensual desire for many days, but after some time they return to mind slowly. Is this craving or just the nature of delusion? Thank you, Ajahn. Yes, that's because samatha meditation, even to the stage of jhana, uh, suppresses the defilements, but it doesn't eradicate them. It takes the insight to eradicate the defilement. So, uh, if one transcends sensuality by sitting in jhana, and that can persist after the jhana for some time, one can feel very buoyant and free of that sensual cravings, but then they're not eradicated at the root, so they will infiltrate back again. That's just the nature of it. Okay, how do we do the Buddha meditation in Thai Forest tradition? Okay, that I've already done that question. It's exactly the same. Being unable to fulfill wholesome chandas such as Dhammachanda, unable to help others, can also lead to suffering. Is there tanha inherent in these two? Well, that'd be two separate things. If you have a desire and impulse to help others, but you're thwarted, you're blocked somehow from doing that, then the approach of wisdom is just to accept that and move on. But tanha can arise as a in the form of negative feelings of not being able to get one's desire. So then it turns into tanha. Yes. Do we have to meet the same people again in rebirths? Not necessarily, although that does seem to be a common theme. When we have stories about people being reborn, that's often into the same groups, same families, and associates, but rearranged. How about chanda for nibbana? Yes, that's dhammachanda, the desire for liberation. Is conceit an advanced form of craving? Even non-returners have it. Why is it so difficult to not have it? Well, conceit in that context, it doesn't really mean like being conceited. It's conceit as a corruption of perception. Is defined as it's a subtler form of the self view. It can manifest. It's sort of like conceit, the English conceit, because there's still a conceit of me being the center of the universe. But it's a defilement. Is said to be the defilement of perception of sanya. So it's not really craving. Is it true that every being we meet in our life has been our mother, father, previous lives? Um, that is specifically taught in Mahayana that all beings are at one time our mother and our father and so on. It's mentioned in the Visuddhimagga as extremely likely, without being absolutely definitive, because of the infinite nature of samsara and the constant shuffling of beings. There's a very good chance that any being you encounter has at one time been your mother or your father, your brother, and so on. When what's a non-returner, and how do you know if you've reached that stage? A non-returner's anagami is the third stage of enlightenment, and one would know it by being completely beyond sensual desire and ill will. If those arise even in very mild, subtle forms, one's not an anagami. Can one go to other realms without dying? Um, Not in the normal course of things, but it is possible. There are beings who have psychic powers where they're able to project their consciousness into other realms. It's certainly not a common thing. You can't get there by ordinary means. You can't take a spaceship to Tawatingsa. Okay, I think we'll maybe wrap it up now. Thank you all again, and next week we go on to the third noble truth. Okay.